So if you're betting on sports, you will have noticed that most of these sports now have no crowds whatsoever, no spectators to cheer on their favoured team or player. So what impact has that actually had on the underlying sports? Well, I made a prediction about what would happen when crowds were removed from individual sports a little while ago, and I now have enough data to tell you exactly what happened. So let's have a look at that in this video. Please like and comment on this video. That will allow me to produce better quality videos and more of them. And if you're interested in learning from somebody that's been doing this for over 20 years, then subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon if you want notification of new videos as they're released. So when it was announced that football was returning, they announced that they were returning without crowds. And in the video that I did at that point in time, I was hypothesizing about exactly what would happen. Now, I have looked at home advantage in previous lives, and it was something that always interested me. And, home advantage, I've always recognized as being something that exists, and it's worth about 0.4 of a goal a game. But I'd also realized through various bits of research and other things that, when you looked at it, it appeared that the reason that home advantage was a thing was because of the influence that the crowd was having on the officials. It sounds a bit unusual, but that was basically the upshot of some research. But the problem is that there's never been the ability to have a control sample in a football match. So you haven't been able to sort of say, right, okay, we're going to play 10 games without a crowd and 10 games with, and we're going to do a direct comparison and see, you would not be able to do that. So lockdown actually produced a great opportunity to identify and see specifically what actually occurs. So the previous video that I did was hypothesizing about what we would expect to see. But with all of those seasons played out now, we actually have the advantage of looking at data where there were definitely no crowds and there are no mitigating circumstances. And we're actually able to extract exactly what happened in comparison with the part of the season where there were crowds. So in this video, we're going to have a deep dive into that. We're going to look in detail at specifically what happened across a couple of different leagues and then in aggregate in total of all of them to understand, what actually does happen when you remove crowds from a football match. So without further ado, let's have a look at that. The first one we're going to look at will be the Bundesliga because that was the first one that returned without crowds and gave us a clue as to how perhaps some of the other divisions would play out. But there are some individual variations within there. And then we'll have a look at what happened overall and draw some conclusions from that. But let's have a look at the first example of that with a detailed explanation of exactly what we're looking at in the data. So now the level of detail that we've got here is quite large. So I'm going to be using notes here. I'm going to be looking down and then hopefully looking up and pointing at statistics that come up behind me on the green screen. And that is because there's a certain level of depth that we need to go through to explain it properly. There's no point in just going, oh yeah, this happened. I like to give you a little bit of depth so that you can make a proper judgment on your own terms, rather than just sort of saying, yeah, do this. Here's 3 ways to make an income from betting. No, we're going to go into the detail of it and you can take your observations and judgments from that. So the first one we're going to run through in depth. I don't apologize for that. It's just so that you really fully understand exactly what you're looking at. And I'm going to describe each one of the individual bits in great depth for the first example that I give you. But for subsequent examples in different leagues, we're just going to go through it a little bit quicker, that you understand, now that you understand what each of these things mean. But yeah, necessarily the first one I'm going to have to explain in a bit of depth so you get a grip on exactly what I'm talking about here. So the first thing to note is if you look at the columns on the left-hand side, you'll see loads of 1s and 0s. So a 1 is representing when a crowd was present, and a 0 is representing when a crowd was not there. So the 1s and 0s are the alternate states, with a crowd, without a crowd. So the first sort of box that we're looking at here is the percentage chance of a home team winning. So we're saying this is the Bundesliga, this was the first league that returned and that we could observe. And if you look at that, it was fairly obvious to me what was going on straight away. It didn't need any maths or complicated spreadsheets. Home teams were not winning as frequently as they should do. Now, I started going against the home team almost immediately because I felt strongly based upon the research that I'd done before that that was the right thing to do. And got lucky in that the Bundesliga was, it was very dominant that home teams were struggling, because there were many weekends where you'd only see maybe one or perhaps two home teams win out of the entire league. But let's look specifically at the data and see how that manifests itself within the market, because it's important to look at it properly. I've seen a couple of people and even some academic reports that have not judged it correctly because they were not looking at the they just misjudged it. They were looking at one aspect but not the other. It's very, very simple to do that, and it's very simple if you're looking at data to interpret it incorrectly. So I'm trying to give you here a full interpretation of what I see and the conclusions that I draw from it, because it's all not crystal clear, as you will see in a second. If you watch through the video properly, you'll see that we're seeing a couple of little variations, but nonetheless we will draw a conclusion that will help you profit as we move into the next season. So on the top of this particular imagery that we have here, you will see that we've got a W%, a D%, and an L%. So we're looking at it from the home team's perspective, and the W is the win percentage, then we've got the draw percentage and the loss percentage. And of course we've got the ones and the zeros representing with a crowd, without a crowd. So you can see on the Bundesliga, 45.73% of matches played prior to lockdown resulted in a win for the home team. And then when lockdown came, we could see that that dropped to just under 43%, 42.78. So there was about a 3% decline. If we look at the draw, you can see that the amount of matches that were drawn was more or less the same. So it was a direct transplantation from the home team to the away team. Basically, the home team advantage declined and went to the away team. Now, the next one that we will look at is probably the most important thing, because looking at the decline, it's only 3%. That's relatively small. We're saying there's a slight shift from teams losing home advantage and that getting put onto the away teams. But the next bit is actually looking at the market odds and seeing how wrong the market odds were. So you can see prior to lockdown, the home teams were winning about 2.5% less than they should have done. The negative 2.42 is saying, based upon the odds and the implied probability that those odds gave to the market, the home teams were winning slightly less than they really should have done. You can see the draw is occurring slightly less than it should have done, and the away teams were winning slightly more than they should have done. So it's basically saying, if you bet on the away teams, you would have made money. If you bet on the draw, you would have made a small loss, and if you'd have bet on home teams, you would have made a slightly bigger loss. But if you look at the line below that, when the crowds aren't there, you can see that it's much more stark. So while there was only a 3% less chance of the home team winning, the market was discounting a much, much higher chance of those teams winning. And therefore, there was a massive drop. The difference between what was expected, given the odds that were available on that match, and what actually happened was about 11%. So if you'd have laid at the start of the period with no crowd teams to the end of the season in the Bundesliga, you would have cleared at about an 11% profit, which is massive. Believe you me, I've been betting for many years, and a double-digit edge is astronomical in general terms. But you can see that the draw was about the same, and you can see that it shifted to the away team. So yeah, there was quite a large difference there in the Bundesliga in terms of the outright result when you measure it against the odds that were implied. So the percentage does not equal the difference or the variation in the odds that are on offer. That's what I'm trying to say here. And that's the most important thing. Not that top line percentage, it's how do you do compared against what the market expects. That is the big one. So if we look at the next section, this is measuring the number of goals that were scored. So this is an attempt to explain why the home teams didn't win as frequently as they should do. And you can see here that the number of goals scored by the home team was about 1.75, and that dropped to 1.4. So there's, they're not scoring as frequently as they should have done. The away teams are scoring more frequently, but you can see that the home supremacy, the number of goals that the home team scored above the amount of goals that they conceded, shifted from 0.24 positive to negative 0.24. So basically, the home teams lost about half a goal a game. And that explains that 11%. You can see how big that shift is there on that particular occasion. If we look a little bit deeper below there, the number of shots that the teams had on targets, you can see that, it was about 14.6 versus 13.4 in the number of shots that the home team had. The away team pretty much maintained that. The number of shots actually on target was 5.27 against 4.89. So you can see there actually that the number of shots that teams were taking, the number of shots that were on target, didn't alter that dramatically. However, the number of goals that they scored did alter dramatically. I haven't looked specifically in the data set at how the goals were scored, but there may be an explanation in there as to how that is the case, because if it's penalties, free kicks, or decisions that require some level of official involvement, then that may have influenced that particular outcome. Because if we look at the number of shots, there's not that much difference, but the outcome is very different. And if we look down on the next level, I'm looking at the number of yellow cards and red cards as well to see if there's some influence here. But if we look, the number of fouls that were committed rose on both sides. So officials didn't seem to worry too much about giving fouls. They dished out fouls more frequently. And if you look at the number of yellow cards for the home team, they went up. The number of yellow cards for the away team dropped ever so slightly. So basically overall, when you look at those statistics, you can realize that there's a sort of inversion going on there, but generally the home team is racking up a few more cards in the away team necessarily isn't. The number of red cards sort of moved as well, but it's such a small number overall that it's difficult to sort of really draw too much judgment from there. But yeah, the Bundesliga it was a league where the home advantage was lost fairly significantly. And while the overall result only dropped a few percent, based against the implied odds that the bookmakers and everybody else was offering, the fall was about 11%. It was very significant. So we had a look there really in depth at the Bundesliga, and that gave us a view on what happened in that league. But of course, we can't take that in isolation. We should be looking at what happened in all of the other leagues as well. So let's rattle through a few of those. And I'm going to speed up the analysis now, because now that you understand what you're looking at, if you don't rewind the video and have a look again, we can just rattle off some of the observations that we saw in other leagues, because it's important to look at it from a broader basis. So in the second tier of German football, again, we saw the home teams won slightly less than they should have done. The away teams won slightly more than they should have done. It didn't particularly translate, though, into a variance above what the odds were actually showing us. So basically, that was saying that's what was expected. And if we look at the number of goals, the actual home supremacy went up slightly from the first half of the season. But again, that's probably a variation in terms of fixtures. The number of shots on target and overall were sort of broadly similar. And the number of fouls committed was sort of broadly similar as well. But we did see a discrepancy in that there were more yellow cards awarded to the home team than there were to the away team. And in fact, the number of yellow cards awarded to the away team had declined. Red cards, I think, are too variable to be able to really take anything into account. So I'm going to skip over those on these examples. If we look at the English Premiership, then we can actually see that the home teams won slightly more than they should have done when we look at the odds, but not in absolute terms. So again, I would sort of put this down to a sort of fixture list type thing. And we can actually see that the away teams won slightly more than they should have done. But again, when we look at the comparison in terms of what was expected as defined by the odds, that actually came in a little bit lightweight. So you can see it's beginning to counteract some of what we saw on the top tier of German football. And when we look at home supremacy, the home advantage effectively, we actually saw that creep up slightly. So again, maybe that's a fixture list type thing. We were looking at teams towards the end of the season and therefore had more incentive to win, and they're more likely to win at home, perhaps. We'll come to the conclusion in a minute. If we look at the number of shots, roughly about the same. But the interesting thing again is if we look at the number of yellow cards issued, it had declined a bit, but more especially for the away team. And again, we're ignoring red cards there. If we drop to the Championship, the second tier of English football, again, home teams won slightly less than they should have done. Away teams won slightly more. And we are actually seeing in the second tier of English football that in fact, against the implied probability that were given by the odds on those individual markets, there was an advantage of going against the home team and going for the away team. And when we look at the home supremacy, that was sort of wiped out. And again, when we look at the yellow cards, the interesting thing here is that the home teams were given about the same number of yellow cards, but the away team were given about half a card less, which was quite interesting. There's sort of a pattern developing, which is why I'm running through these. And what we need to do now is we really need to, each of these individual championships, so the Bundesliga, the second tier of German football, as well as the second tier of English football and the Premiership, are showing slightly different variations. And one of the reasons for that is that they were at different points of the season. Some teams had played the top teams, some had not. The teams were in relegation situations or trying to push for Europe. So you're not comparing exactly like for like. What we need really is an entire season without any crowds, but really we don't want that, do we? But can you see what I'm trying to say here? There's different fixture lists will probably skew the results somewhat. So what I also did was basically merged all of it together to come to an overall conclusion. So you can see that on the individual leagues, there's some sort of variation between individual leagues. However, you can sort of explain this by the fact that different leagues were at different points of the season. Some fixtures had been played that were skewed towards one end of the table or different teams or the other. And that sort of changed the mix of some of these individual leagues. So it's more important to look at the whole picture and understand how that plays out. And by including all of the major European leagues together, the Spanish, the Italian, the English and the German leagues, we can cancel out some of that individual variance on those leagues and come up with a broad picture. So what was the conclusion that we could actually reach on that basis? Well, you can see that conclusion behind me, and I'll just talk over some of the salient points of what we saw. But basically, teams were losing at home more frequently than they were when there were crowds there. That is an accepted consequence of not having a large crowd at home. And we were seeing very little variance on the draw, and as a consequence of teams losing or more likely to lose at home, obviously that would lift the away teams. So that was a fact. We did see that. However, when you look at the betting market, it's sort of watered down a bit because, of course, the betting market would sort of reach similar conclusions, or you would expect it to. So as a consequence, we did see some of that discounted into the betting market, but nonetheless, it still wasn't discounted quite enough. I did suspect that this may happen. If you watch the other video, you'll see that I was saying it may take some time for the market to learn exactly what that variability is, and therefore it may take a while to reach it. But when we look at what would have happened if you would have bet on teams losing at home, you can see that they actually did lose a little bit more frequently than you would expect, and the away teams did win a little bit more frequently. When you're actively trading, you tend to amplify results. So an outright betting strategy is what you see on these spreadsheets, but when you adopt a trading strategy, you tend to get a higher return. Too complicated to explain on this video. But when we look at the number of goals that were scored, we did see the supremacy drop a little bit. So basically the home team wasn't scoring as many goals. So we have to sort of ask, well, why was the home team not scoring as many goals as they previously had to do? Why was that variation slightly less? If we look at the number of shots on target and the number of shots overall, they're sort of roughly similar. A couple of minor variations, but not dramatically enough to explain why we saw the home team scoring less and therefore winning less than we would typically expect. So the answer comes to us when we look at that bottom line, which is the number of the number of yellow cards that were given by the referees and the number of red cards to an extent. Although the red card number is so small, I don't think we can rely upon that data. So it's primarily our focus is looking at yellow cards data. When we look at all of these leagues thrown together, we can see that the home team was given slightly more yellow cards than they were when there was a crowd at the stadium. But when we look at the away team, you can actually see the number of yellow cards that the away team is getting has actually dropped off quite a bit. So you sort of feel that what is happening here is what we sort of suspected, and what prior to this period, various studies, including my own, have implied, that it is official bias that is influenced by crowds. So you can sort of imagine that because there isn't a crowd breathing down the neck of the officials, they're probably more likely to give yellow cards to home teams. Those fouls on the edge of the area, or those 50-50 or not quite sure challenges, are resulting in sort of fairer decisions. Because if we look at the number of yellow cards on average issued to the home team, it's 1.76, and to the away team, it's 1.66. And that's changed quite a bit from the period when there were crowds in the stadium itself. And as a consequence of that, you sort of think that that's probably leading to more chances for the away team, and slightly better chances. And also, obviously, if a defender gets yellow carded, then they're less likely to make that 50-50 tackle in future, which is probably giving a little bit more space and creating better quality opportunities for the away team. So that's my conclusion, is that the lack of crowd has made a difference. It is making a difference, and it's doing it, and you can see how it's influencing it from that yellow card data, and we can see the data coming out in all of the other stats. I suspect that this is going to carry on at the start of next season. It's going to be interesting to see how next season starts, and we'll get more data and we'll be able to qualify this further. But there's always this element of, is this being discounted into the market as well? And that's why I've shown you all of these stats in great depth, because you can have a look at it and you can start to form a judgment on whether you think a team is mispriced or not. Because the home advantage has certainly diminished, but, you know, home teams still do win more frequently than the away team. And so there are probably other factors at play there. But the lack of a crowd has certainly diminished that home advantage. Anyhow, I hope you'll get some use from all of that. I hope this video has been useful for you. If it has, give me a like. And if you want me to discuss any aspect of it, give me a comment, and I'll look at those and take that into account when I'm producing future videos. So yeah, hope that's been useful for you, and hope you get something out of that ahead of the restart of the football season.